I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over grand old buildings when something has changed. Not the comfortable silence of an empty afternoon, but the heavy, deliberate kind. The silence of people who know something and have collectively decided not to say it. That was the silence that had descended over the fictional royal household of Ashford Palace in the early weeks of a gray English autumn. To outside observers, nothing appeared different. The gilded gates still opened at precisely the same hours. The ceremonial guards still stood with the same rigid discipline. The press office still released the same carefully worded statements about upcoming engagements, charitable initiatives, and international visits. But inside those ancient walls, in the carpeted corridors and paneled drawing rooms where decisions were made without minutes being taken, something had quietly but unmistakably shifted. James Thornton Lee, the elder son of the fictional Queen consort Lady Cecilia, had always occupied an unusual space within the Ashford royal world. He was not a working royal. He held no title of his own. He attended no official engagements in any formal capacity. And yet, for years, his presence at informal family gatherings, private dinners, and quiet weekend retreats at the country estate had been accepted, not celebrated, but tolerated with the specific kind of polite neutrality that the royal household had perfected over centuries. He was simply there. And then, almost overnight, he was not. The first sign came at the Ashford Autumn Gathering, a private family weekend held each year at Stonebridge Manor. James had attended for the past 6 consecutive years without incident. His name simply did not appear on the guest list this time. No explanation was given. No phone call was made. A brief message was conveyed through the household's private secretary. Regrets, the weekend's arrangements had changed, a smaller gathering this year. James understood, as people in royal adjacent circles learned to understand, that this was not an explanation. It was a door closing. The second sign came 3 weeks later, when a charity luncheon connected to Lady Cecilia's foundation took place at a private London venue. James had previously attended such events as a quiet supporter, seated away from the cameras, present but unobtrusive. This time, his invitation simply did not arrive. When his assistant made a gentle inquiry, the response from the foundation's office was courteous, swift, and final. The seating arrangements had been reconsidered. They hoped he understood. He did not entirely, but he was beginning to. Within the fictional royal household, few figures carried as much quiet authority as Princess Helena. 72 years old, with a posture that had never once accommodated slouching, and a gaze that had unnerved prime ministers and foreign dignitaries alike. She was the institution personified. She did not do sentiment. She did not do ambiguity. And she had absolutely no patience for what she privately called blurred boundaries. It was Princess Helena who had first raised the matter, not in an open meeting, not in a formal memorandum, but in a way that truly important things are communicated within such institutions, in private, quietly, with the full weight of her position making every carefully chosen word land like a stone dropped into still water. She had requested a private audience with the King's most senior private secretary, Lord Alderton, on a Tuesday afternoon in early September. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. No record was kept. When Lord Alderton emerged, his expression was unreadable, which, for those who knew him, communicated a great deal. What Princess Helena had conveyed, in her precise and unhurried manner, was this: she had become aware of certain patterns that troubled her. James Thornton Lee's informal access to palace-adjacent spaces, events, and internal communications had, in her assessment, quietly expanded beyond what was appropriate for someone in his position. He was not a royal. He was not a working member of the household. And yet the ease with which he moved through certain internal circles had begun to raise questions, not about his character specifically, but about the integrity of the boundaries that governed who held proximity to the institution and why. "I am not making an accusation," she had said, with a particular calm of someone who does not need to raise their voice to make a point land. "I am raising a concern, and I believe it is a concern that deserves a careful and considered response." Lord Alderton had listened. He had asked 2 questions, and when the meeting concluded, The machinery of the palace, that vast, silent, invisible machinery, had begun, quietly, to move. To understand why Princess Helena's concern carried the weight it did, one had to understand something of the history she carried with her. She had been a royal since birth. She had watched the institution navigate divorce, public scandal, tragedy, and relentless media scrutiny. She had seen what happened when boundaries became unclear, when people who existed at the edges of the royal world began to move toward its center without the checks and accountabilities that structure demanded. She had watched, with the precise attention of someone who understood institutions as living things capable of being damaged from within, how proximity to power could quietly reshape influence in ways that were difficult to undo. Her concern about James was not rooted in personal dislike. Those who knew her well noted that she had always been perfectly civil toward him in the few social situations where their paths had crossed. Her concern was structural. It was about the architecture of access and what happened when that architecture developed unexamined gaps. Lady Cecilia, James's mother and the fictional queen consort, occupied a position within the household that had taken years to fully establish. She was loved, in the way that takes time, not the immediate warmth of public infatuation, but the slower, deeper acceptance that comes from watching someone show up with consistency and grace through difficult seasons. Her position was no longer questioned. Her dedication to the institution was not in doubt. But her son was a different matter, and Princess Helena's concern, as it filtered through the appropriate channels, was less about him as an individual and more about what his quiet, gradual expansion of access represented as a precedent. The institution, as Helena had said many times, was not a family in the ordinary sense of the word. It was a public trust managed by people who happened to be family. And public trusts, she believed with every fiber of her considerable conviction, required clear lines. The response to Princess Helena's concern did not take the form of a dramatic confrontation. There were no raised voices, no summoned meetings, no formal letters of exclusion. The palace did not operate that way. Instead, what followed was a series of quiet adjustments, small calibrations that, taken individually, might have meant nothing, but viewed together described a clear and deliberate direction. Event lists were reviewed. Guest arrangements were reconsidered. Communication, routed informally through James's channels to palace-adjacent contacts, was gently redirected. The social geography of the institution shifted imperceptibly to most, but very perceptibly to those who had learned to read its signs. Within the household, reactions were divided. There were those who agreed entirely with Princess Helena's assessment, who felt that the gradual creep of James's informal access had gone unexamined for too long, and who were relieved that someone of her standing had given voice to what they had privately noted but not felt positioned to raise. These were largely the traditionalists, people for whom the institution's continuity depended on the precise maintenance of its internal structures. There were others, fewer in number but not without influence, who felt that the response was disproportionate. James had never caused a scandal. He had never overstepped visibly. He had attended dinners and charitable events and quiet family weekends, the kinds of things that other people in similar positions did without comment. Was his access genuinely problematic, or was it simply being examined more closely because of who his mother was and the historical sensitivities that surrounded her place within the family? These conversations did not happen in open meetings. They happened in snatched exchanges over coffee, in brief words exchanged in corridors, in the kind of careful, deniable diplomacy that the royal household had refined over generations into something approaching an art form. Lady Cecilia herself was placed in an extraordinarily delicate position. She was aware that something had changed. The withdrawal of James's informal access was not something she could fail to notice. But the channels through which she might ordinarily have raised a concern were the same channels through which the decision had been made. And navigating that without appearing to challenge the institution she had spent years demonstrating her loyalty to was a challenge of considerable complexity. She said nothing publicly. She attended her engagements with the composure that had become her signature. And privately, she was understood to be processing a situation that had no easy resolution and no clean lines of right and wrong. One of the most remarkable things about the way such institutions manage internal tension is the extent to which silence becomes its own form of communication. The absence of a statement is a statement. The absence of an invitation is a message. The absence of a name on a list that previously contained it is, to those who know how to read such things, as loud as a public announcement. James Thornton Lee understood this. He was not naive about the world he had moved adjacent to for the past several years. He had watched how it worked, the controlled distances, the managed appearances, the way that even warmth was calibrated and deliberate. He had always known that his position was borrowed rather than inherent, that his access depended on a tolerance that could be withdrawn as quietly as it had been extended. Knowing this did not make the withdrawal painless. He had, over the years, formed genuine connections with people within that world. He had come to feel, perhaps more than was wise, that certain doors were open to him not merely by grace and convenience, but by something approaching belonging. The realization that this sense of belonging had been, in some ways, a misreading of a more conditional acceptance was its own particular kind of loss. He did not speak to the press. He did not issue statements through lawyers. He did not reach out to sympathetic journalists to offer his perspective on what had happened. He understood, with the instinct of someone who had learned from long proximity to the institution, that to do so would be to confirm every concern that had ever been raised about him, that he was someone who would leverage his connection to Lady Cecilia for personal positioning, that he lacked the discretion that life within royal circles required. And so he was silent, and his silence was noted and interpreted, and in some quarters quietly respected. Weeks passed. The quiet adjustments became the new normal, as quiet adjustments always do. The guest list stabilized in their revised form. The informal channels of access remained closed. The palace continued its public-facing operations with seamless composure. Events attended, causes championed, statements released, photographs taken. From the outside, nothing had changed. The institution presented, as it always did, an unbroken surface. Whatever had shifted internally remained internal, discussed in careful terms by those who knew, speculated about in vaguer terms by those who suspected, and invisible to the wider public who had no reason to look for it. Princess Helena resumed her schedule of engagements without comment. She had raised a concern. The concern had been addressed. That was, in her view, exactly how such things should work, not through drama or confrontation, but through the quiet functioning of institutional mechanisms that existed precisely for these moments. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel guilty. She felt, if anything, simply that she had done what her position required of her. Lady Cecilia continued to demonstrate the grace and commitment to duty that had defined her role within the household. She did not allow the situation involving her son to visibly affect her public performance. Whether that composure came easily or at considerable personal cost was something only those closest to her could have answered, and those people were not speaking. James moved on with his life outside the palace's orbit. He had interests, work, connections that existed entirely independently of the royal world. Life continued. It was simply a different shape than it had been before. There is an argument, made seriously by serious people, that institutions like the fictional Ashford monarchy serve their purpose precisely because they maintain structures that ordinary human relationships cannot sustain. The argument goes, trust cannot be informal, access cannot be casual, and proximity to power must be governed by accountability, or the whole edifice begins to develop cracks too small to see until they become cracks too large to repair. There is another argument equally serious, that institutions which prioritize their own structural integrity above the human beings who exist within and around them risk becoming so focused on preservation that they lose sight of what they are meant to preserve, not their own power, but the public trust that makes their power legitimate. Both arguments contain truth. They have always been in tension within institutions like this one. They will continue to be in tension long after the current cast of characters has moved on. What happened to James Thornton Lee in this fictional story was not a scandal. It was not a crisis. It was a quiet institutional adjustment made by people who believed, sincerely, that they were protecting something worth protecting. Whether they were right, whether the concern was proportionate, whether the response was just, whether the silence that followed served anyone well, are questions that the institution itself will never publicly answer. But the questions remain, as they always do, in the corridors where the carpet muffles footsteps and the paintings on the walls have witnessed more history than they could ever tell.